You know the expression usually invoked in times of organizational or societal distress, we are all in the same boat. But in recent years, it's been corrected rather forcefully in the wake of recent global upheavals that exposed the extent of inequality in the world today. Increasingly, there's a coming to terms with the fact that we're not in the same boat. Rather, we are in the same storm, but in different boats. Some are riding it out in super yachts, while others are in rickety canoes with one oar. Income and wealth inequality has direct and negative consequences for global economic and social stability, and even impacts global security. That's why it is rightly front and center of the G20 agenda. Good evening, I'm Thula Sizwe Semelane. Welcome to this episode of G20 Focus. We're exactly 13 days from the G20 Leaders Summit, where global inequality will be among the issues taking center stage. The World Bank says South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. South Africa's Gini coefficient, a measure of economic inequality in a population used to represent income or wealth distribution, is around 0.63. Because the Gini coefficient measures inequality from 0 to 1, with 0 representing perfect equality of wealth distribution, a society where everyone shares equally, and 1 representing perfect inequality, where only one person in a society would own everything. Countries want to stay as low as possible on the scale, and you can see why South Africa's 0.63 is a huge problem. Global inequality is the subject of the first ever G20 Inequality Report commissioned by President Cyril Ramaphosa to the G20 Extraordinary Committee of Independent Experts on Global Inequality, co-chaired by world-renowned economist and Nobel Laureate, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. The report warns of what it calls a perfect storm created by world events that have combined to increase global poverty and inequality. But are world leaders willing to end global inequality? That is the question we are asking. In receiving the report earlier this week, President Cyril Ramaphosa said addressing inequality is an inescapable generational challenge. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in studio by David Ansara, the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, and Thokozile Madonko, who joins us virtually from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. So as I said, in receiving the report earlier this week, President Cyril Ramaphosa saying addressing inequality is an inescapable generational challenge. Let's take a look at this clip now, this insert.
People across the world know how extreme inequality undermines their dignity and chance for a better future. They also see the brutal unfairness of apartheid or vaccine apartheid, where millions in the global south were denied the vaccines to save them. We have the resources to narrow the gap between and within countries. Now, with this report, we have clear actions that we can take as governments, as well as societies, and as the global community to reduce inequality. It is now up to us and as leaders of the G20 and the leaders of the world to demonstrate the necessary will and commitment.
So before we delve into the issues this evening, let's watch this exclusive interview with Professor Joseph Stiglitz, conducted by the SABC's special correspondent, Sophie Mkwen.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you so much for your time. President Ramaphosa appointed you and other people as experts to look at what could be tabled before the G20 summit. Before we get into some of these issues, can you take us through the work that you've done thus far? And what was the mandate?
Yeah, the mandate was a very broad mandate to look at the inequalities that were evidently increasing in many dimensions around the world. Asked questions about what were they looking, what were the dimensions of them, what were the drivers, what caused them, what were the consequences. Our committee, for instance, argued that there were very negative economic consequences, but we were also, even some of us, more worried about the political and social consequences. And then, importantly, what could be done about it? Not in terms of specific recommendations for any particular country, but were there things that could be done, and benefits and costs of each, and providing a menu for countries and international leaders to think about. So that was our broad mandate, and there are many, many dimensions. Some things have gotten, better. When we say we said there's an inequality crisis, but we also recognize that poverty globally is down, but that's mostly because of the success of China. China has brought down poverty by hundreds of millions of people. But if you look at what's happening at the top, more and more wealth, income is concentrated at the top. We're creating a plutocracy of wealth.
Can you briefly tell us your definition of inequality?
Well, as I say, we look at all the dimensions of inequality, income, wealth, health, access to justice, opportunity. They're all correlated, they're all related to each other, but they all have a life of their own to some extent. And you can some countries, even with a high level of income inequality, or wealth inequality, do better in health. Others do worse. U.S. does very, very poorly. But there's another aspect that we emphasize. A lot of people just take inequalities as a fact of life, and some people have more able than others. But we trace a lot of the inequalities to what we might call the economic rules of the game. If you allow monopolies, the owners of the monopolies get richer and richer at the expense of other people. And one of the arguments that we say why this should be on the G20 agenda, South Africa heading the G20 now, why it should be on the G20 is the international rules of the game also matter. The trade rules, the intellectual property rules, the financial rules, how the IMF, World Bank were operating.
Transformation of this financial institution or system.
Exactly. So it's how our whole global economic system works, plays into the determination of these inequalities.
The issue of neoliberal policies, some people are saying that they are an impediment to what we are talking about, addressing inequality. What could be the best option in terms of addressing this inequality and, the skewed wealth enjoyed by the few?
Well, there's no magic bullet. I believe very firmly that the doctrines of neoliberalism have contributed in many ways to the aggravation of inequalities. For instance, when you said, let markets operate on their own, don't try to interfere, we've had a number of consequences. One of them is a growth of monopoly power. It's more money at the top, but that more money at the top means they're charging higher prices, which is hurting people at the bottom. And one aspect that I think is particularly bad for our society is that today's monopolies are not just steel and tobacco or oil. They're things that are central to the functioning of our society. The tech companies, the monopolies in the media. And the media are the 21st century town hall, how we interact with each other, the narratives that are put forward. So the very wealthy have a disproportionate role in shaping how we see the world. And that perpetuates that kind of inequality.
How serious is inequality if you were to break it down?
I think it's become very, very serious. I think the aspect that I find most disturbing right now is the growth of the oligarchs at the top, the concentration of wealth at the top. And it's important not just because if we had it more equally distributed, we would not have the kind of problems of hunger, the fact that millions do not have an adequate education to live up, enable them to live up to their potential. Millions are suffering from inadequate health care. So all that wealth that goes to the top is being pulled away from the bottom and leading to these extreme deprivations. But that concentration in wealth is driving our politics and undermining our economics, because a lot of it is distortions in our economy caused by market power, market manipulation, not by normal workings of competitive markets, but by the abuse of market power in one way or another, exploitation in one way or another. And what worries me is that it's getting more and more entrenched. There are estimates over the next 10 years that some $7 trillion will pass from one generation to the next. That's just an enormous amount of wealth, not as a result of each individual's own efforts, but because he chose the right parents. And he starts the life with a big head start over everybody else, a violation of our principles of equal opportunity. So to me, the depth of inequalities, today's inequalities, has become very worrisome.
Welcome back to G20 Focus. We continue our conversation with Professor Joseph Stiglitz in this exclusive interview. In this segment of the conversation, our colleague Sophie Mkwena asked him about his views on the proposed controversial imposition of a wealth tax on the rich to end global inequality.
There's an understanding within the G20 member countries that there should be the wealth tax. But it's not binding. I mean, if something is not binding, clearly implementation will be problematic. How can President Ramaphosa push his counterparts within the G20 to ensure that this does happen?
So first you have to understand, for a number of years, the G20 has lacked consensus. It operates on consensus. But, with Russia, with now with the United States, denying climate change, and at the top of the global agenda is climate, you're not going to get consensus. That's the reality. And the leaders of the G20 have come to recognize that. So that means, how can you use the opportunity of being the leader of the G20 to advance a global agenda around which most of the world, but not everybody, agrees? And that's what your president is doing in a very, very thoughtful and I would say clever way. It's what President Lula did last year as in the presidency, and you see it bearing fruits. So what President Lula said is these are what we call plurilateral initiatives. You get the coalition of the willing. The people are willing to do that. And it was so obvious after the last pandemic that there was vaccine apartheid. You felt it here in South Africa. South Africa with India put forward a proposal for a vaccine waiver. It was absolutely necessary, and they refused at the WTO. But one aspect that was important was, if we have another pandemic, Africa needs to have the production capacity. Latin America needs to have the production capacity. And that was an initiative that President Lula pushed, just like he pushed the wealth tax on the super wealthy. So these are efforts that are going to be undertaken by groups and countries. I often put it in terms of what are the norms, the expectations of normal countries. Yes. Not everybody, but here are the, and what your president is doing now is saying the norms should be to create more equal societies. We all talk about it, but let's understand what's going on, and if we can understand it, we can then work together better to address it. So I have to say, I think it's a really important initiative.
Let's look at the United States of America as the incoming G20. President Trump has been very clear that this agenda that was put forward by South Africa, supported mostly by developing countries and some of the wealthy nations, he is not for this agenda. What challenges lie ahead?
Very clearly. I jokingly say President Trump wants to maximize inequality, whereas the rest of the world wants to get it down. You know, that's why the design of the policy interventions has to be the coalition of the willing that goes beyond the G20, but is motivating most of the members of the G20. So the pandemic response, you know, not every member of the G20 is participating in it, but most of them are, but countries that are not members of the G20 will be involved. I envisage this International Panel on Inequality is not a G20. It's created by the President of South Africa, or let me put it more, it's his legacy, but his leadership is getting the countries together, and I hope is obviously much broader than the G20.
Your message to the leaders: you will not be there when they are talking behind closed doors. This is the moment to send a message based on your report in summary.
Maybe two sentences. The first is that we face an inequality crisis like we face a climate crisis. Inequality has soared. The ways in which it's soared have been particularly pernicious for our societies. We're not going to eliminate inequality, but we can, it's a choice. We can reduce the extremes, the most pernicious effects, the most harmful effects in our society. You as leaders can do something about it. But that's this, and the second message is, if you're going to do something, do it on the basis of facts and our understandings of the sources, the dimensions, the interrelations, the consequences, what we know from what has worked and what has not in various contexts. Every place is different, but so we're not going to tell any particular country, but we can, this panel can say, this has worked, this has failed, this is the reason this has failed. But inequality is a choice, and you can do something, but do it on the basis of theory and evidence. And evidence is really important. And this international panel on inequality would be a lasting legacy, would be an institution that would enable the world to carefully, thoughtfully address this scourge that has always been with us, but help us begin to make an attack on this in ways that I think will actually promote economic growth, promote economic stability, and promote democracy.
If leaders don't act, what are the consequences?
Well, I think if leaders don't act, our societal divides are going to get larger and larger. There are very strong, what I call polarizing effects. And those polarizing economic effects then get reflected in our politics and our society. Those at the bottom know there's no way that they're going to get, they lack aspiration. Those at the top think they are entitled. Both of those are bad for the functioning of our society. And especially when people think that the inequalities are not deserved, they're a result of the system being rigged, of market power, there's resentment. It creates a fertile field for demagogues. And there's a large supply of demagogues everywhere in the world. So there's a lot of evidence of a link between inequality and democratic erosion. And so what worries me is that it is bad for our economy, but it's really bad for our democracies.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your time.
Thank you.
So that was world-renowned economist and Nobel laureate Professor Joseph Stiglitz in conversation there with Sophie Mkwena. When we come back, we engage our experts on this burning question: are world leaders willing to end global inequality? Coming up in just a moment. Welcome back to G20 Focus. So to discuss the question that we are asking this evening, I'm joined in studio by David Ansara, the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, as well as Thokozile Madonko from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. But we thought before we get into the conversation, let's show you a global picture of those countries with the highest wealth per person, wealth distribution per person. Right at the top there is Switzerland with $687,000 on average, just the average person in terms of their own wealth. The United States follows immediately after that, and Hong Kong, the territory of Hong Kong, as you see, all the way coming down, all the way to Taiwan. So that's the global picture. But we also wanted you to, just for further perspective, when we're talking about inequality, we're talking about income inequality and wealth inequality. And in many instances, we're talking about the gap between the wealthy and the poor. So we wanted to show you the number of dollar millionaires, everyday dollar millionaires on the African continent. And that picture looks like this. South Africa has 41,000 dollar millionaires on the continent. Egypt, 14,800. Morocco, Nigeria, Kenya. So those are the countries that lead in terms of dollar millionaires. And you juxtapose that naturally with people who are barely scraping by to eke out a living on a daily basis. So let's pick up the conversation. Let me start with you, David, in studio. We watched an insert, that conversation with Professor Stiglitz and these figures that we are seeing. When we say global inequality, what in your assessment do we mean by that, and how bad is that problem at the moment?
Well, I respectfully disagree with Professor Stiglitz's assessment. I actually think that inequality is perhaps not as bad as people make it out to be. I think what is a problem in economics when we have these discussions is and that's the variable that we should be focusing on, is what is the state of poverty. So the difference between the poor and the rich, I'm less concerned about than the fact that there are many, many poor people in the world, and particularly here in South Africa, we have a very high unemployment rate, 32% on the narrow definition, and 29 million people dependent on social income grants. I think that's a very unfortunate statistic, because that means that there's a lot of dependency on the state. And so I think that we need to be encouraging people to create more wealth rather than redistributing wealth. And how you do that is through free markets. Free enterprise is a great driver of human prosperity. And we've seen that throughout history, in recent history. You could almost think of it as a great enrichment. Over the last 200 years, the size of the global economy has increased 100-fold. There's been a massive increase in global wealth. Absolute poverty has also declined. In about the 1820s, about 90% of the entire world was living in absolute poverty. There you had extreme levels of inequality.
Right.
But today, the number of people living in extreme poverty is only about 10%. I mean, that's 10% more than what we should have. But if we continue to embrace openness, free trade is very important. Globalization has really included a lot of people who are on the margins of the global economy into productive activity. And if we let people pursue the profit motive, profit and loss, by the way, then they can, through following their own incentives of the market, they can improve their circumstances.
You said it very, very nicely, set it up very nicely for me to take it to Thokozile Madonko. Thokozile, to the extent that you can, just in your own words, capture your sense of the gravity of the problem of inequality. But I do suppose that you will also, in the same vein, be wanting to respond to some of what you've heard from David.
Thank you, and good evening to the viewers. I think it's very interesting that David has set up a kind of contra-argument to Professor Stiglitz's point, which is that let's not focus on inequality, let's focus on poverty. But I want to say, well, where does this poverty come from? And how long have we been hearing about free markets, free trade, and, you know, that's kind of people can bring themselves up by their bootstraps and somehow we're going to generate wealth from poor people. The reality is we have poor people because we have very, very wealthy people. We live on one planet that is suffering enormously at the moment. And due to climate crises, due to inequality, due to poverty, unemployment, and due to very skewed economic policies that David is referring to, which is about pushing the neoliberal agenda around private enterprise, competition at all expenses, has not got us very far. In fact, even though he's mentioned that global poverty has come down to 10%, what he's not saying is that that is skewed by what China has been able to do, given the sheer numbers in China. But the reality is 1 in 4 people globally go hungry today. That means they have to skip meals. And that is, on our watch is an absolute tragedy, should not be happening. And so while it might seem quite seductive to say don't focus on the wealthy, I want to say it is absolutely time that we focus on the wealthy. And that's why this report is so important, because it talks about how it is that people live, how it is a policy choice to have dollar billionaires and a policy choice to have people going hungry on a regular basis. And so because it is a policy choice, we can do something different. And that something different is what this report speaks to, and what Professor Stiglitz spoke to, is that we need to have better economics that serves the planet and serves people, and better ways of delivering public services that are of a good quality, that enable people to live decent lives, and quality universal social protection to make sure that everybody is cared for in a crisis.
David, I don't know if you want to come back to that point once again. I mean, part of the point that Professor Stiglitz was making is the doctrines of neoliberalism contribute to aggravation of inequalities? This free market idea that you're talking about, near laissez-faire free market, is that what you are championing and advocating for?
Yes, I'm a strong proponent of free market capitalism. Like I said, it's really been the great driver of prosperity. And on the particular issue that Thando raised about the that Toko raised, sorry, about the people going hungry. I mean, in 1960, the average person in the world had about 2,200 calories per day. Today, it's 2,900 calories today. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it's gone from 1,800 calories per day to 2,300. So all of these metrics are going up. And so I think we need to actually have a bit more of a grounded empirical conversation, I mean, about what is actually happening. So I think Professor Stiglitz was right to say that there is a high degree of political and social disruption that we're experiencing. And I think if you look at many countries, you know, there's been waves of populism that's been rising. And I actually attribute that not to the prevalence of free markets, but actually increased state intervention and the politicization of economies. The kind of interventions that Toko is
Can I ask that we pause it there, and I'll pick up on that point, I promise you, on state intervention, and you're saying politicization of economics. I'll come back on that point. You're watching G20 Focus here on SABC News, but we're also live on SABC2 and SABC Plus. We continue with our conversation in a moment.
Our editorial guidelines are anchored on independence and impartiality. That is why credibility and trust is core to our DNA. From Saldanha Bay on the Cape West Coast, we've been bringing you wall-to-wall coverage. I'm Vanessa Puna, SABC News, independent and impartial.
Welcome back. This is G20 Focus. We continue our conversation with David Ansara as well as Thokozile Madonko. David, just before the break, you were making the point about state intervention in the economy and what you called politicization of the economy. The flip side of that though, David, people like Professor Stiglitz would point to the oligarchs, emergence of oligarchs, if left unchecked, if neoliberalism and those policies are left unchecked, as well as monopolies and some of the excesses of monopolies. What do you say to that?
So on the point of monopolies, I mean, down here in South Africa, we have a number of monopolies, and they are state-owned monopolies. Eskom, Transnet, you name it. There's lots of state-owned enterprises. You can't generate electricity or reticulate water without the permission of the government. So I think when we talk about inequality, you can think of three things. There's inequality of outcomes, which is how much wealth do people have. There's inequality of opportunity, but then there's also inequality of permission. And I think it's that third one. This is what Deirdre McCloskey, another economist, has highlighted. That you actually need to give people, you need to remove barriers to opportunity. So, you know, I'm not 6 foot tall. You know, this is the lottery of my genetics. As much as I practice basketball, I could never play in the NBA. You know, so that is just an unfortunate aspect of life, right? But I think it's important when you look at, do people have a fair shot? And I think that's very important. And I think just to get back, what we're seeing is a lot of governments trying to intervene to create economic outcomes, but actually creating a lot of secondary effects that are highly negative. I mean, the Professor Stiglitz referred to a wealth tax. They're doing that in the United Kingdom at the moment, and it's creating capital flight. Capital goes where capital is treated best. And I think it's very important that here in South Africa, we say we are open to the rest of the world. We want, your graphic said there were $41,000 millionaires in South Africa. We need to double that. Mm-hmm. Poor people benefit from the presence of rich people. That's why people go and work in Dubai. That's why people go work in Hong Kong, because these are open, pro-market jurisdictions that generate wealth.
I see Thokozile shaking her head vigorously. Thokozile, talk to that point and the point about state intervention. Should we be leaving these markets and the economy without state intervention? Basically, let the markets play themselves out. We need more dollar millionaires. People go where the wealthy are, and where the wealthy are, opportunities are created, is what David is saying.
So, I mean, I'm a little bit disappointed. I don't think David has really engaged with the report that Professor Stiglitz headed, because there is loads of state intervention. And that state intervention enables the creation of the $41,000 millionaires that we have in South Africa, but the billionaires globally, because this is a G20 conversation as well. So when we're talking about requiring the state to enable the ease of business, or for companies to be able to become monopolies, like Professor Stiglitz was mentioning in the insert, is precisely done by state intervention. And so what he is not really saying is that under a free market, neoliberal world, you still have the state. But what you also have is huge amounts of defense spending, because rich people tend to be very insecure, and because they create large amounts of poor people. So he can talk averages and say, on average, people are getting X amount of calories. But that doesn't tell you about what it actually means for the median person, which is that, we're talking about 2.3 billion people starving, or going hungry, going without food. So we have to be very clear that we can either have state intervention that is good economics and good policy and good democracy, or we can have what he is in favor of, which is the withdrawal of the ability of the state to, one, be active in the economy. So his kind of laissez-faire is not doing us very well, and it has done very poorly for the planet. And then secondly, it's important that we remember that it's not just everyone who bears the cost of what he's proposing. It is predominantly women and poor women who live in rural areas. So we also have to be quite clear about who we're talking about when we're saying poor people benefit from the rich. Who are these people that benefit from the rich? Because the reality is 2.3 billion people are going hungry and having to skip meals globally. And we don't need to have this kind of wealth inequality. And also, lastly, I just want to point out that there's no real empirical evidence that there is capital flight because of a wealth tax. It's very, very difficult for very, very wealthy people to move their assets. For example, if you own a wine farm in Stellenbosch, either you sell it and we get the tax anyway from the sale, or you have to try and uproot your whole wine farm, or and move it with you to wherever you're going. So wealthy people have assets that are very hard to move, factories, land. So they can move their paintings, their yachts, their airplanes, but it's much harder to move finance, and we would tax it anyway if they were to leave. So even it's a bit of a myth to say there's going to be capital flight. But what we do need, though, which is a real point that David is raising, is we need international tax agreements that enables us to tax everybody at a bare minimum, that enables that prevention of the race to the bottom. Because the reality is we need to do something fast and quick about our existential crisis around climate change. And we need to be able to redistribute wealth in a way that benefits everyone, not just the few.
All right. I think let me pause there for a moment. In a moment when I come back, David, I'd like for us to move the conversation and perhaps be more global about it and sort of have the conversation at the level of the G20 and perhaps cite examples where great progress has been made in reducing poverty and inequality, and perhaps start moving in that direction. So we'll have that conversation in a moment. Do stay with us. Welcome back. This is G20 Focus. Let me start with you, Thokozile. Let me pose the central question of the show with the G20 leaders coming and the significance of the G20 in terms of the countries and economies that it represents. When we pose the question, are world leaders willing to address, to end global inequality? What would be your best answer, taking into account the practices of G20 countries and perhaps some examples where there's been interventions that have had the effect of reducing poverty and inequality?
I think it's a mixed bag, to be honest, and more research definitely has to be done. And I think we are pulling in multiple directions from a leadership perspective. And partly this is ideological, it's political, it's the legacies of the neoliberal move turn from the 1980s, in which many countries are now grappling with how to provide services to their populations, but to do so in a way that enables this extreme wealth, or continues this extreme wealth. And so the beauty of it is that we've had leadership from a number of countries, Brazil being the most recent, to say that something has to be done about poverty and inequality. I don't want to skip the fact that this conversation has to take place within the context of climate change. And so there are many countries like France, like the UK, like those within the OECD, that have been looking at wealth taxes, that have been looking at trying to, even in Switzerland, for example, they've looked at capping executive pay. So trying to get a situation where workers get fairer wages. So the wage gap between the highest earner in a company versus the lowest earner is not that wide, because that has grown over time. Also to start looking at how to increase innovative ways of taxing finance, so on financial transactions. So there's been a number of mechanisms in place to try and see how we can redistribute public wealth again, because a point that I think is often forgotten when it comes to talking about extreme wealth is that wealth is gained on the back of workers, of people as well, and also from the planet. Right. And so it is public wealth. It is not an individual, I woke up this morning and I'm a billionaire. The sad thing is that what happens is the billionaires are passing it on to their children, which then means that then gets exacerbated. So you have intergenerational inequality
in
that
perpetuity.
Seems to appear that they have naturally, that they've naturally gained this wealth.
All right, David. So sorry about that, Thokozile. I do need to give David an opportunity to talk to the direct question that we are asking within the context of the G20. Are world leaders willing? Does the political will exist to end global inequality?
Well, I agree that the G20 is very fragmented and has different interests. And I think it goes to the heart of the G20 itself. Like, what is it really for? And it was formed in the wake of the global financial crisis, which many people said was, this was the zenith of free market capitalism, and showing all of the faults of it. But actually what it was, that global financial crisis, was governments providing implicit guarantees to financial institutions, which incentivized them to take huge risks. And then when they failed, the government then came with taxpayer money to bail them out. And I actually think that was a negative thing to do, because that creates a moral hazard. And so I would say, under those circumstances, capitalism is about profit, but also loss. Risk-taking entrepreneurs must have skin in the game, and we must reduce the role of the government. So that includes across the board. Governments today, and The Economist wrote about this very recently in its special report, are incredibly over-indebted. South Africa has a debt-to-GDP ratio of 80% and rising. The United States has a $37 trillion deficit. Okay? So we need to cut back on state spending. We need to stop with social entitlements and also big grandiose projects like the national health insurance, which will be massively
But don't those
damaging to our health
complement,
system.
David, don't those complement the work being done on the incomes side? So, for example, in South Africa, you're seeing this trend, especially for JSE-listed companies publishing the earnings even before the amendments to the Companies Act come into effect, but also putting earnings floors such that in our company no one is to earn beneath this. Doesn't that necessarily need to be complemented by a social wage of some sort if we are to lift people out of poverty?
The wage is a function of supply and demand. Workers, even low-skilled workers, have something that businesses need in order to improve their productivity and their overall production. It is a contract between consenting parties. If you have the government coming in and saying, you need a national minimum wage, what you're effectively saying to those many millions of poor people is we are preventing you from working. You're not allowed to work. And that is consigning them to a life of misery and poverty. So I say scrap the minimum wage, let the free market enter the labor market, reduce all of these restrictions on Labor Relations Act, the National Minimum Wage Act, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. We have an unemployment crisis in South Africa. You want to talk about unemployment, inequality? That's the big drivers, the labor regulatory framework in this country. And it's a function of the increased power of the trade unions here. So we need a job seekers exemption certificate. We need to cut back the role of...
But you didn't talk to the balance, and I'm completely out of time. You didn't talk to the balance between interventions on the income side as well as the social wage, which is what I
say don't intervene on the income side. Let the market drive that.
But because of time, we didn't get to you talking to the social wage, because I was saying combined interventions on the income side plus the social wage lift people out of poverty.
The only way to lift yourself out of poverty is to generate new value. No government's going to do it for you.
All right.
You're not going to redistribute your way to wealth. You have to generate new wealth.
Okay, fascinating discussion. I'm completely out of time. Thank you for coming through. David Ansara is the CEO of the Free Market Foundation. We were also joined by Thokozile Madonko from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. That's it for this week. Join us again next week when we look at South Africa's readiness to host the G20 and whether it has done enough to lobby for its priority issues at the Leaders Summit. That coming up in the next week. Cheers.